Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is so fun to watch your faces get added to the screen as we roll from 2 to 3 to 4 screens full of folks who are here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Heather Loughlin, president of the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and on behalf of the foundation and of our generous sponsor and longtime partner, First State Bank and Trust, I am delighted to welcome you today to Conversations of the Valley, a community forum hosted by the St. Croix Valley Foundation since 2004. The mission of our foundation, of the St. Croix Valley Foundation, is to enhance quality of life here in the St. Croix Valley. And we do that by supporting and encouraging charitable giving, by connecting people and their resources with local programs, and by encouraging collaboration. And it's that third piece, collaboration, bringing individuals and organizations together to find solutions to shared community concerns. That is really the piece that these conversations of the Valley are all about. Getting people like you together to learn, to talk, and to think about how we might respond to current and emerging issues. The theme of this year's series is placemaking. And my guess is that most of you are here because you are passionate about this place, the St. Croix Valley, this place that we have chosen to call home. For some of you, that choice may have been made for you generations ago, but you have chosen to stay. Others of you have chosen to come here. You've chosen to make this your home. But whatever the case, and whether you're connected throughout the Valley or really are rooted in one specific community, you recognize that what we have here is something special. I hope many of you have had a chance to see the first 2 programs of this year's series. At our January kickoff, we heard from Dr. Catherine Laughlin, called the City Doctor, and heard from her about, or she helped set the stage for this series by outlining the 3 factors that really do contribute to attachment to place: aesthetics, social offerings, and being opening and welcome. She also explained how attachment to place relates to economic growth. Then last month at our February Conversation of the Valley, John Robert from Smart Growth America talked with us about the built environment. The built environment is what we build, where and how we build it, and whom we build it for. John Robert presented several success stories on ways that the built environment has contributed to attachment to place and advances for economic growth and development right here in the United States. So today we are going to hear from a panel. So this is a little different. We've got a panel of folks to share information and stories with you. A panel comprised of representatives from, get ready, I'll try to breathe while I'm saying this, the University of Minnesota Extension and the International Institute of Minnesota, and they are really going to talk with us about how to build welcoming communities. We know from Dr. Laughlin in our first session that being open and welcome is one of those 3 factors that contribute to attachment. So our speakers are going to address some important questions. First, who is coming to our region and what is their experience? Then why is it important to build communities that are welcoming? How does it contribute to economic growth and vitality? And last, and perhaps most importantly, what can you do? What can I do? What can we do to make our communities more welcoming, and what resources are available? So that's our plan for today. So before I introduce our panel, just a few quick words about our Zoom format. You've probably noticed that you are muted. That's to help us keep things running smoothly. But we do hope to have some time for questions at the end. So if you have questions while our speakers are sharing with you, please type them into the chat box, which is probably accessible through that little chat box icon at the bottom of your screen. And then we do suggest that you put Zoom on speaker view. Our presenters do have some slides to share. So the majority of your screen will be filled with them as they're speaking or their slides. But if you want to scroll through and look for friends, you can go to gallery view and do that. So I'm now pleased to introduce our panel. Jane Graupman is the Executive Director of the International Institute of Minnesota, a nonprofit organization that provides comprehensive services to new Americans. During her 32 years with the Institute, she's been instrumental in creating a nationally recognized careers pathway a top-performing refugee resettlement department, anti-trafficking services that help new Americans maximize their talents and become fully contributing members to American society. She's just one of our 4 panelists. Jennifer Hawkins is an extension educator for community economics serving the Southeast region of Minnesota. In this role, she works with community leaders across the region to choose and create their future, by leveraging data, information, and university resources. She has extensive professional experience in higher ed and as an economic development practitioner. Thanks for being here, Jennifer. Neil Linscheid is an extension educator at the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. His work is focused on supporting local leaders as they navigate economic changes taking place in their communities. His mission is to teach, coach, and connect local leaders as they try to make informed decisions about their community's economic future. And finally, thank you, Neil, for being here. Finally, Scott. Scott Chazdon is an evaluation and research specialist with the Extension Center for Community Vitality. His work with Extension has focused on community social capital assessment, community readiness, including the Welcoming Communities Assessment, social network analysis, and the use of ripple effects mapping, a participatory group evaluation process that documents the impacts of community development programs. I don't know how we are going to fit this all in 1 hour, but we are going to try. Panel, thank you so much for being with us today. The virtual microphone is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. And St. Croix Valley has been such a great partner to the International Institute of Minnesota, and I'll talk about that more in my presentation. But it's really a pleasure to be here. Your community has really rallied for new Americans in our community. So we're going to jump in. Can head to the next slide. Yeah, so I have the honor today of talking about the who are the new people coming to our community. So the International Institute of Minnesota is a nonprofit. We're located in St. Paul, right across from the State Fair on Como Avenue, which is a great landmark to be by. And we're just very excited. We just moved into our new building that we've been working on for over 5 years. And St. Croix Valley the Anderson Foundations have been big supporters of that new space. So we welcome you all to that new space. We hope to be open to the public in April. So I'm going to jump in. Who are the new Minnesotans coming to our state? So one thing that I'm going to talk about just briefly is some just context setting and terminology setting. So I'm going to be talking about immigrants at large. So all the immigrants coming to the United States. Immigrants come on many different visa types to the United States. The largest groups within the immigration group are visas for people rejoining their family members that are here. And then also H-1B visas, which are filling labor market needs that we have. So jobs that we don't have enough Americans to fill, we are able to provide H-1B visas for smart people that are doing jobs, a lot of them in the technology space that we don't have enough workers for here. And also within the immigrant population is refugees, a term you all know. And so I'm going to talk, I have a whole slide on refugees, so I'll talk about that more often, or more in the next slides. But refugee is a status within the bigger immigration population coming to Minnesota. But as you can see from the slide, we do have a significant number of immigrants in our community. It's 8.5% of our population. That was in 2019. I think that number's actually maybe gone down a little bit in 2020, just because there were fewer refugees arriving in that last year, 2020. But it's right around there. So it's not a big percentage of our total population, but it is a significant number. And I think we all see the benefits of that with new businesses and communities being revived within our state. So I thought you might find it interesting to find the top 5 countries of origin that people are coming from to our state. And again, so Somalis are the largest, 20% of the total immigrant population. And so most Somalis have come to Minnesota, to the United States as refugees, whereas folks from Mexico have come as immigrants. I think in the 32 years I've been at the Institute, I don't know if there's ever been refugee status for folks coming from Mexico. And if so, it'd be very, very insignificant numbers. Ethiopians have come both as mostly as refugees, but also some as immigrants to the state and to the country. And then folks for Ecuador would be the same, but most of those have come on immigrant visas. And then folks from India have come not as refugees, but as immigrants to Minnesota. All right, so refugees are a very special group of people within the immigrant groups that are coming to Minnesota. So unfortunately, there are over 20 million refugees in the world. There's actually more than that, but those are folks that are in camps and have been documented by the United Nations. So it's a very large number. When I started at the Institute, that number was about 3 million. So it has grown significantly over the decades. And as unfortunately, we've all seen in the news, that number is going to increase very quickly and quite dramatically with the Ukrainian refugees fleeing their country to Europe. So Minnesota does have a reputation, and it is true that even though our refugee population in pure numbers isn't very large, it's probably a little over 100,000, it is a significant percentage of our immigration population in Minnesota. So it is, when you take the total immigrant population and the refugee population as a percentage, is the highest in the country. So we're very proud of that. And that is because, in the late 1970s and the passage of the Refugee Act in 1980, Southeast Asians predominantly were coming to Minnesota, and they found it a very welcoming place. Not only for places like the Institute that actually resettle refugees and other resettlement agencies, but also churches and community members were a huge part of making people feel welcome here. And so then other families join them here. Somalis are a great example of that also. So many Somalis were resettled to Minnesota, but many of them came as what we call secondary migrants. They left other states and came here because they had family members, and also their family members that were here said that they found it to be a welcoming place. And also, immigrants are no different than the rest of us. They are looking for opportunity. They want to find, where are there safe places to raise their kids? Where are there good schools to send their kids? Where is there economic opportunity for their parents and for the adults taking care of their families? So because we have a diversified economy here, and we do well even in recessions in our state compared to other states, people know that and feel that because they can get jobs. And if they get laid off, often they can find jobs in other states. And that's reflected in our low unemployment rate in Minnesota. So there you have the populations both in St. Paul and Minnesota, the percentages. So the majority of refugees and immigrants are in the metro area, but as you know, there are significant numbers outstate as well. One last thing, and that's okay to change the slide, we're fine here, Angie. So I just want to also mention that, how do refugees get into the United States? It's also unique because every year, this is very unusual. The president of the United States decides how many refugees are allowed into the United States. So that happens in September in preparation for the federal fiscal year in October. So who is president has tremendous influence on the number of refugees that come to the United States and from where they come. They are supposed to consult Congress. That is happening less and less, I would say. So who is president really determines who's allowed and the number of people allowed to come to the United States. All right, so who's going to be arriving in 2021 and 2022? The federal fiscal year starts in October. So one thing very unique about this year, so it's really starting in September of last year through February of this year, we've resettled over 1,200 Afghan. They really are like refugees, but they came under a different status, humanitarian parolees. And so that happened within 4 months. That was a large number of people to resettle. It's going to be 70,000 by the end of the federal fiscal year resettled to the United States. And Minnesota will probably do about 1,500 of that 70,000. So that happened in record speed. I've never seen that in the 32 years that I've been here. That's really an amazing feat that just happened. And so our community is very busy welcoming Afghans to our community. And as you see in Ukraine, it was very similar with Afghans. They had to flee, and with most refugees, they have to flee within days. Afghans actually had 24 hours, most of them, to leave their homes, some of them not even that long. And many of them had to walk with their families to Kabul from long ways, which is not unusual for refugees. The trips to refugee camps, or in the case of Afghans or to other countries, are harrowing journeys. They're very dangerous, as we're seeing in Ukraine also, and that is very typical of the plight of a refugee. The Congolese refugees, so that's a group that started arriving a little over a decade to the United States and to Minnesota. That will be one of probably the highest number that we received this year, aside from Afghans. And those folks will be coming as refugees. And it's the largest refugee population coming to the United States as well at large. So Eritrea and Ethiopia will also be a significant numbers coming from there. Iraqis not as large of numbers. And from Burma, we'll have Korean refugees still arriving. We haven't seen too many yet this year. And we don't know what will happen with Ukrainians right now. They're providing temporary protected status for people that are already here. And we're not hearing anything about them becoming a part of the refugee program for this year, but that could happen. All right. So as you know and can imagine, leaving your country and going to a second country and then to the United States, a third country, as an immigrant or a refugee is very overwhelming experience. It's a lot of adjustments, and it makes a very big difference, as I always say, if you're 20 or if you're my age, 60 soon to be 61. It's a very different experience. So learning a language at 61 is much harder than it is if you're young. And so people are coming here at all different ages and have so much information in addition just to the language that they have to learn. And I love this picture because I think it gives you an idea of something you may not have thought of. But for all the refugees that arrive, we have orientations at the Institute, as do other resettlement agencies. And you might not think that that is something we have to teach people, is how to walk on ice. Because most of the climates of the countries that we're resettling people from, they don't have ice or snow. So that's just a great picture that really reminds you of some of the very big things and the smaller things that people have to learn. But it's new schools, new cultures, and it's overwhelming. And it takes a good year before people really, I think, are feeling like they have some sense of operation in their new culture. Lastly, I just want to say I love this photo. This is 4 women who graduated from our nursing assistant training program. I'm sure this picture was probably taken about 4 years ago. I'm sure several of them are now nurses, which is a big part of the work we do at the Institute. We've placed 600 nurses in hospitals and long-term care centers in our community, and over 3,000 healthcare workers. So we don't know where long-term care and healthcare would be without new Americans in our community. They're a very important part of the labor force. And in 2019, and I don't think it's much different for 2020, this is a really astounding statistic, 97% of the new workers in our labor market in Minnesota were new Americans. They were foreign born. So they are the future of our labor market. And so I think most of the women in this picture came as refugees. And so while it's a humanitarian gesture, a grand humanitarian gesture by the United States, that investment and that opportunity turns back into very important contributions to our community in the labor market, in taxes, in refugees and immigrants don't get enough credit for how many businesses they start at all levels in our country. And that's always been true, and it's no different with the new Americans that are arriving now. And then lastly, I want to say just a big thank you to St. Croix Valley Women's Alliance. I think they've since changed their name, but they made warm meals for our nursing assistant training students and our other students in our building for a year, every month, because we didn't have on-site food. for folks. They have been, your community has had been incredible volunteers helping to set up apartments for Afghans that are arriving that we had to do in record speed. And then the Stillwater Rotary has been really digging into how can they help. And they've also been doing setups and other really important work for new Americans. So we're just very grateful for that. It is not an overstatement to say that we absolutely could not do our work with support from community members. It is critical to our work, and it helps with the work that we have to do, but it really helps with people feeling welcome. So thank you to all of you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jane, for those introductory remarks about who's coming to our state and our region. And thanks to the Foundation for convening this conversation, because it really is so important. And I'm just happy to see all of you on this call today and to be able to be a part of the conversation and contribute to this area of mutual interest. So as you heard in my bio, I am an economics person. I work in economic development. And so my slides are really going to focus on why is welcoming important. And I think first off, I'll just say, I think at the very basic level, welcoming is important because of this idea of a golden rule, right? Like we should treat each other the way we want to be treated. So I think about when I moved to a small community after graduate school for my first professional position, how it was a little bit difficult to get embedded into that community. But once I did, once someone invited me to dinner, I had my crew of people that made me want to stay there and spend time in the community and really help it grow. So I've experienced that, and I imagine that several of you have as well. But beyond that, I'm also a numbers person. I like to see hard facts, and there really is some data that demonstrate why welcoming is important to community vitality. And Jane mentioned some of that data. I'll reinforce a couple of her points, I think, in my slides, but I'll start with this quote from the Treasury leader. So he talks about rural communities that are supporting inclusive development and tapping into the potential of all their residents will have the competitive advantage in the economy of the future. And I think that's very, very true. I see it. I think there's more and more sentiments like this in the think tanks and the people that are really thinking about economic growth and economic development. This is the theme of economic development right now. And the Federal Reserve in particular is doing a lot of work around this idea of inclusion and welcoming. They have this really neat dashboard or a database where you can plug in your state and see the economic impact of inclusion work. And their analysis is suggesting that proactive welcoming and inclusion efforts can potentially unlock billions of dollars in economic activity just for Wisconsin and Minnesota. So it's very eye-opening when you start to dig into the data. And so in the next couple slides here, I'll talk a little bit about demographics, some economic data, and then community livability is sort of where I'll spend my time here during our conversation. So first I'll start with the demographic argument, and I think Jane mentioned this as well, but a faculty member at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, his name's Ryan Allen, he did a big analysis of the numbers for Minnesota. So his findings are showing that deaths are outnumbering births. So without migration, people moving to Minnesota and our communities from out of state, we are losing population. So migration, domestic and international, is important. So attracting people to live in our states is really critical. And he furthermore suggests that international immigration is where we have maybe a bit of a comparative advantage, that we are doing fairly well in attracting international immigrants to our state. So this has implications for our local economies in terms of the ability of firms to be able to recruit workers. If you want to sell your home, is there someone there to buy it? He actually goes on to suggest that just to maintain our current labor force growth rate, we're going to need almost 5 times the number of people moving to Minnesota in 2045 than have been moving here since then. Another interesting point that he brings out in his report is that Minnesota led the nation in international immigration in the 19th century. We're lagging a bit now compared to the United States, but we really were a strong destination for international immigration at one point. So as we think about communities and our communities in particular, we're in a race to the top to attract human capital that are going to help us survive and thrive in a global economy, and being a more welcoming place gives us a leg up in that race. So the other part of the data that I'll elevate is this idea of the economic argument. So people's contribution to the local economy beyond just beyond workforce. So our center did some research in 2017 on rural business succession. And one of the interesting findings from that research showed that about 1/3 of people buying businesses in rural communities had no connection to the community. So they're coming in, folks are coming in from out of the community to buy businesses and invest in the local communities. Another set of data comes from the Small Business Administration, the Kaufman Foundation, and the Partnership for a New American Economy. And the quote here reflects that the findings of that data, that immigrants actually have a significantly higher rates of entrepreneurship, that they're starting more businesses per capita than native-born Americans. They suggest that some of those personal motivations that inspire people to uproot their lives and move to the United States for new opportunities and can also inspire immigrants to start businesses. They are also often opening businesses in underserved markets and neighborhoods where there may be less willingness to invest among other folks. So they're able to come in and really revitalize and offer new goods and services in communities, neighborhoods, rural communities through this entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial endeavors. And I think we've seen this play out in Minnesota in places like Wilmer and Worthington, where they are just really bustling downtown areas that have a mix of businesses owned by newcomers, as well as folks who maybe have owned businesses for generations. It's a family business. It's been there for 40 or 50 years. There's also an interesting example in Ontario right now that's combining this idea of business succession, rural economic development, and immigrant attraction. They've created a program that's designed specifically to attract immigrant entrepreneurs to smaller communities. And like I said, either starting a new business or buying an existing business and making sure that that firm stays and grows in a community through those investments. And then finally, there's the livability argument. So newcomers are bringing foods, culture, language, services, goods, and really adding a rich diversity to the communities that they're settling in. And this diversity can be critical in supporting that modern economy and creating this quality of life to attract and retain workers and citizens throughout the next century. So we're seeing that people want to live in small communities. I think Neil might talk about some of the research that he's been working on in terms of resident attraction. People do want to live in small communities. It's quality of life, it's safety, it's pace, it's all of these really great things that we know make small towns great. There was a really neat study from Ernst & Young that was showing that millennials actually have almost a similar preference for urban areas as rural areas. So people that you might not think even want to live in smaller communities, their data is showing that they do. I'll also note that there was an article in the Sahan Journal in Minnesota. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but I can put the link in the chat after I wrap up here. But they had this really lovely article documenting international immigrants that have chosen rural communities because of the quality of life they offer, brought their communities, really embedding and investing in communities such as Worthington and Austin. Both of those communities are also proactively undertaking welcoming community activities. So the data here on my slide actually goes back to some of Neil's work in attracting and retaining newcomers. And this data is saying that it's not just about attracting people, but it's about retaining them and keeping them once they move in. And so one of the questions in his study was the intentions of newcomers to stay in the community that they relocated to. And here, the data are really clear. It's showing that if they feel welcome, they're much more likely to stay, put down roots, and invest their time and money in the community. So I think there's a lot of great reasons to be thinking about this. And now I've covered some of those, so those high-level data points, and Neil and Scott are going to dive into how communities are doing this and some of the tools that are out there to help communities think about where they are and where they might take some action to be more welcoming and inclusive to newcomers.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, and I hope that everyone is being convinced on the importance of this. I know I am, and I'm learning a lot from our previous two speakers here. What I want to do is spend some time talking about what your options are and how you might think about those. And then Scott and I will dig into a really specific tool that we think has been really helpful, particularly around welcoming. But I want to give you some sense of a framework on how this all fits together: welcoming, recruiting residents, keeping them here. And this is something that we've been working on with people that are involved in resident recruitment and welcoming initiatives all across Minnesota and in the Midwest, trying to understand what are people doing in communities, what are leaders like yourselves choosing that they can take on and do and be successful with. And this framework here is really just a series of questions that I think if you answer every question that I have here in each of these segments, you would have a really good plan to start with. You would be doing a good job at covering the landscape of things that you might need to do to recruit people, welcome them, but also make sure that they want to stay. And I just want to give you a sense of what those questions are. We really think it's important to start with understanding who the newcomers are in your community and what their experience is like. And we have lots of tools that can help you do that. But one of the easiest places to start is to talk with people like Jane, who are already involved in welcoming newcomers and can give you some insight into what their experience is like and what's going on. The next easiest thing you can do is to talk to them directly. New people are in your community. In other work that we've done, we could show you that every county in the United States has newcomers. It's not a surprise. But starting with understanding is a great place to start. And then often communities, they like to think about how can we market and get our message out there. We have a variety of examples that I won't go into today of how communities do that effectively. But I think the important thing that you'll see in many of the examples, if you just look around at how communities portray themselves to potential residents, is that they're trying to show this people of various different backgrounds that are successful in living in their community and tell those stories. Those really resonate with folks, and communities that market themselves as a great place to live, and not just like we have a park and some trails, which are important, don't get me wrong. But it's showing that there are people that live vibrant lives that really is effective. We also see that people are going the next step in recruitment, which is saying, we're telling our story, but we have maybe a concierge ready for you. We have people that if they find out you're interested in moving here, we'll follow up with you. And that's much more active than the sort of passive marketing approaches that are out there. Now, in the center of all of this is welcome. So there's sort of this stage of we want to get our message out. We want to get people interested. And then if they move here, we want to make sure that there's a welcome. And I'll talk more about this in just a second. It's the most important part of all of this, I think. But what some things that people forget is that we also have to make sure that after we've welcomed folks, that they remain engaged, that we're asking them what they'd like to contribute, that we're not just sort of ghosting them and they don't see us. We say, hi, here's the welcome bag. Don't see anyone for a year, 2 years. That's not good. In the end, what we want to be doing is really trying to create a sense of belonging for people that are here, that live in your community, and that's existing residents, but also newcomers. And then understanding that sometimes people will leave. Sometimes people are pulled away by opportunities. It's not just young people that leave your community for an opportunity. And it's everyone has to leave eventually, is a nice way to say this. But the point is that everyone will leave. And we want to make sure that when people think about their place, that they think about it as home. And why is that important in this framework is that, one, they might come back. They might start this circle all over again and come back to your community. Or we have stories, and maybe many of you do, of people that didn't come back, but stayed connected. And when you asked them, they sent a check, or they made a connection that made all the difference in your community. So just thinking about, this is a full life cycle, we think is really important. We'll move on to the next slide. And I'll just give you a few options that relate specifically to welcoming. And then when Scott starts in, he'll talk about this really fourth part, which is a really deep, example of trying to understand and make the community a more welcoming place. So just thinking of welcoming, what are your options? I mean, you can start with the basics, just having a welcome. Like you have some materials, a packet, a bag, a guide, things to distribute. That's the basics. Everyone should have that. Hopefully you do. It's low cost, it's easy to implement. You can do that. The next step is a little bit more engagement. People doing the welcome wagon, making sure that you're maybe going out to lunch with newcomers, getting to know them, really higher personal touch. Even bigger yet, many communities that we've talked with, they have welcome events, and they really have a structured approach so that every quarter, every month, once or twice a year, there is an event where we know we'll be welcoming newcomers. But we've designed that to be an engaging opportunity for new folks, existing residents to get to know each other, to learn about the community, and to find resources that they need. But these are sort of just the first step. Many of us, what we really want to do is not just welcome, but we want to create a community that's more welcoming. And that's a different set of activities that we need to think about. This is the long-term thinking. And how do we get to that? Like, how do we find out, is our community welcoming right now? How do we make it a more welcoming place? Where do we start with that? That's what Scott and I will talk about next. And we think getting to that longer term starts with trying to assess where you're at. Bring people into this discussion of how welcoming are we? Where are places and parts of our community that are doing really great that we can learn from, and that we can build upon their efforts? And where are parts of our community that maybe are not quite there yet? They're just starting in their development of their understanding and their ability to welcome newcomers and especially understand new cultures. So Scott, I think I'll hand it over to you next to talk more about that really specific thing that we've been up to and how you might use it.
Great, thanks, Neil. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about an assessment that we developed. I think I mentioned in the introduction that, or it was mentioned that I'm an evaluation person. So we came up with a tool that allows a community to assess how welcoming it is, and engages residents to really think about different sectors of the community and different ways that inclusion can happen in each of those sectors. So I'm just going to share with you briefly what this Welcoming Communities Assessment is all about. If you'll go to the next slide, I just want to frame it a little bit by an observation that we had where our educators like Neil were working in communities around equity and inclusion. We had a program in southern Minnesota where we really got to understand some of the issues in communities and how best to think about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome. And one of the observations that we came to is that if you aren't actively including, or we could say welcoming, you're probably accidentally excluding. So there has to be a sense of purposeful attention to being welcoming and including people. And interestingly, it might not just be the newcomers. It could also be people from groups in the community that haven't historically been represented in decision-making. So they could be low-income people, they could be disabled people, they could be people of color. There's a lot of ways to think about inclusion, and they're all relevant to this work. So with the next slide, I'm just going to share with you a little bit about how we designed this Welcoming Communities assessment. If you go to the next slide, I'll just share that I engaged with folks from several communities in southern Minnesota, and we looked at the literature on community readiness. And there's a whole bunch of readiness assessments, and it depends what issue you're ready for, but we were focusing on how is a community ready for a welcoming or inclusion. And after looking at a lot of really great tools that are out there, we came up with our own tool, and we decided to focus on these sectors of the community on the left, because what we know doing community development work is that a community is made up of all these sectors. And to really do community development, all those sectors have to be engaged in the work, whatever issue it is you're working on. So we wanted to be able to go into all those sectors of the community, the schools, healthcare, law enforcement, etc. And then we also wanted to focus on these dimensions of inclusion, which we really learned about in the literature that we read together. But is there awareness? Is there engagement? Are there resources? Is there leadership energy? Is there a sense of sharing power? And are there policies and practices in place that promote welcoming and inclusion? The next slide. So we came up with a process where we engaged like a bunch of people who invited the whole community to come. And in the case where we did this in Brown County, Minnesota, we had people from 3 communities come. We had about 80 people show up, and there was a meal. And people sat in small groups for these different sectors. And this one is from the business community. And they went through this booklet, and they had discussion questions, and they each had these survey questions that they filled out as we went through the assessment together. And what came out of that, if we go to the next slide, is a report that we wrote up for each community. So New Ulm was one of the communities that went through this. And the report gave them information about how welcoming each of these sectors of their community is. And from that information, they could really start to make some tangible action plans. And they could learn, if you'll go to the next slide, that some sectors of the community were more inclusive than others. And we're having practices and things going on that were clearly good kind of cutting edge examples of ways to do outreach and engagement with newcomers in the community. And so this is the case, this community here is Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, and we created this kind of nice way to present it all at once with this kind of stoplight imagery. So the green is where there was a stronger sense of inclusion in the school system here. And also, if you look at that column of engagement, there was pretty high levels of inclusion or engagement across all the sectors, interestingly, except for local government. So the community in this case got some very actionable information to begin going through a program to think about what can the school system teach us? What do we need to do with local government? And how can we strengthen these 2 columns at the right, this idea of sharing power and looking at our policies and practices in the community that might actually exclude people because we're still doing things the way we always have. So this, to put it very quickly, this assessment process kickstarts a very good process of thinking through what can a community do to become more welcoming and to sort of change its culture in that direction of welcoming. Next slide. And so I'll turn it back over to Neil to talk a little more about that process of engaging the community.
Well, as we all know, reports are only as good as how well they're used by people. And in community work, we know that when we put together reports like this, even if people are engaged in creating the information that we're presenting, it's critical that we come back together to look at the results and say, now what? What can we do next? How can we do this? And in this case, we brought people together and we looked at each of those sectors and we looked at the results together. And we talked about those results and brainstormed. What are the possibilities? What could we do? What do we know about the school system that they're doing? Let's get really specific. What are examples? Who are the people? Like, let's get some names on here that really could help in these efforts, and identifying people like in a school system that are maybe interpreters, that are English as second language teachers, community ed directors is really helpful when you're talking with other parts of the community that don't have folks with those skills or abilities ready to go. So there's knowledge, there's assets that's already in place. And in these groups, we worked on developing plans and then trying to put some timelines and actions to those. The next step for us was also to lead a cohort to help people learn more of the skills that they needed together in each of those communities, to take those plans and those ideas and move them forward, which we did for the next year after we did this assessment. So just some examples of, things that maybe you've been involved in. It's not a community development program without markers and flip charts and post-it notes. And so that's just the sort of thing that we saw. And it was a very high engagement activity. This is something that I think any community could do if you have the will to talk about these things and the courage to identify these areas where maybe you could do better as a community. Remember, we're thinking about this as big, the whole community, and as long-term. So we have to maybe put our egos aside on whether our organization has failed or something like that, and think about what's the future look like. I think you can move to the next slide. Yeah, again, just images here of you seeing how we structured this and walked around the room. Hopefully this looks like something you're comfortable with and you're doing often. I know in Wisconsin, maybe you do this stuff too. Well, I think I'm the last speaker here, so I want to just say thank you for your time, and hopefully this discussion about the many different points has brought you along on kind of like the big ideas, the big changes that are happening, and then some of the things that you can do, and hopefully you're feeling inspired and excited.
Thank you so much. So if you have questions, either for one another or from the rest of you, please put those into chat. I am wondering, Jane, you alluded to primary, secondary resettlement. And I know that's something I've heard from folks, organizations, faith communities throughout our region is kind of this frustration because they want to sponsor and support refugees, and most agencies' primary resettlement won't happen in Stillwater or in Hudson or New Richmond because their primary resettlement is to a community where they will find support from folks who speak their language, know their cultures, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how faith communities in more rural communities, how they do play a part either through secondary resettlement or through other partnerships?
Yeah, so just to really clarify, because that's a little bit of a work speak, but so when refugees come to the United States, the State Department is the body of the U.S. government that works with 9 national organizations. The Institute's national organization is one, the Lutherans, the Catholics. So there's 9 of them, and they get disseminated amongst those 9 organizations, and then they go to different communities across those networks. And it's usually driven by there is a person from my community that I want to join, or a family member. Sorry, I should say family member, but it could be a non-family member, a friend. And so that's a formal resettlement program. And people say I sponsored a refugee. So they haven't done that in a formal way, but a church will say we've sponsored refugees. And that means that we help them find housing, or we help them get a job, or we worked with a resettlement agency to help them. Of the 9 national agencies, most of them are, have a religious, we're started, like Lutherans, Catholics. I think we're the only non-denominational one, but that's meaningless anymore. They serve everyone. Everybody serves everyone. So I think it's really just, whether it's in the Twin Cities or it's outstate, it's really people with, humanitarian impulses saying, oh, we've seen newcomers in our community. They may not even be at our church, but we want to help them. I think that has a lot of long religious history, right? And in any denomination. So I think it really is that simple, that people in the community have been tuned in and they're like, oh, all of a sudden we're seeing, Mexican, Spanish speakers in our community. We want to learn more about them. How can we be helpful to them? How can we be involved in the chamber? How can we be involved in my church? So it really is people with good impulses and wanting to help. And then that spreads and grows. I mean, I've seen that over my 32 years in this work. It's, oh my gosh, that Minnesotans, we have all gotten so much more educated about immigrants at large, refugees in particular, and people. I mean, like I said, I've been doing this work for 3 decades, and during the Afghan resettlement, I've never seen such incredible support from the community in 30 years. So, and then I would say it's just been gradually increasing. When there's a crisis or there's a large number of refugees getting resettled, or there's a large number of refugees not getting resettled, the community is speaking up, and it's really been incredible to see that. So did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Good.
So.
Yeah,
I'm trying to, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm trying to listen and keep my eyes on the
Yeah,
question.
I know that's not easy to do. Yeah.
So thanks. So kind of related question, someone just voiced something similar to this. One of you alluded to the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. And I've heard a lot of conversation about this challenge about sometimes to make your community welcoming for others. It's stuff you wouldn't think of, right? Because what's welcoming to the folks who are already here might not be what needs to happen to make your community welcoming, to make those who are new to your community feel welcome, to make them feel like they belong. Any tips from any of you about how a community might take on that learning and that process of trying to see things through the newcomer's eyes instead of through their own eyes?
Well, I'm interested to hear what Jane has to say about this, but I'll offer there's a place in understanding, right? Every community is different. And so the definition of hospitality in your place as it stands today, and with the people that are coming, that are new to your community, will be different, and it's messy. And the only way is to engage and discuss and deliberate and to find those answers for your place in particular. Unfortunately, there's not an easy answer. But I think that sort of underlying value of hospitality is cross-cultural and is a place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I love Neil's use of that word hospitality, and it may sound simplistic, but I mean, it can be, in a grocery store and just smiling and saying hello to someone. I mean, it can be really that simple. That makes a big difference to people, really does. It just helps people feel welcome. I lived in Thailand for 2 years. It's a place known for smiles, and it's really true. It goes a long way. And then there's deeper things. I mean, people are volunteering to mentor refugee families, be connected to them, helping to set up their housing. But I think that all starts with curiosity, and also, not rushing to judgment and learning about the cultures where people come from. And I do want to take us, because I think, we do hear from our clients that they find Minnesota welcoming and Minnesotans welcoming, despite our Minnesota ICE reputation. But I think it is different for different groups, I would say. So, Afghans that are here, they're going to have a little bit of an advantage because they worked with the US military. That's why they're here. And so they're exposed to American culture through that, right? And that helps you. Doesn't mean it's easy, it's not. But I would also say, if you're Muslim in this country, and if you're Somali or other Muslims that cover, you are a target sometimes. People know you're Muslim, and there's a lot of people that don't understand what Islam is at all. They have a very warped perspective about that, and so I think I don't want to speak for that community, but I just think it makes you. I know after September 11th, we actually had people swerving their cars at our students walking to school, pretending like they were going to hit them. And I just was horrifying. And so I think it is a little bit different for every group, but it just the whole, you know, just the whole experience is very daunting. To leave your whole identity, your work, your family, everything behind is daunting. And so whether it's a small thing or a big thing, they all help.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. There was a question that, and it'll be interesting to see how you all respond, that asked about the climate refugees. So there's this idea that now we've got people who are actually kind of being forced to leave the places where they've lived because of changes to climate. Is any of that starting to be part of the formal work of your organizations?
I would say for, you know, it's not, so refugee definition, to be a refugee is very formal. You're fleeing religious, race, political or political affiliation. It's very prescribed, the definition, and climate is not included in that definition yet. So that'll be interesting to see if that changes.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I'm hoping my staff team won't gasp when I say this, but I think we are planning to share on our website after today's program resources, not only information about how to learn more about each of these 4 organizations that our speakers represent, but also kind of hopefully answers. Oh, good. Ellen is giving me the thumbs up. So yes, I haven't put new work that they weren't anticipating on their plate. Also, resources for folks who are just trying to figure out, I'd like to get more involved. How might I get more involved? How might my faith group or my Girl Scout troop, et cetera, get more involved? So watch for that. You will receive a survey from us, a link with a brief survey. We hope you'll take a few minutes to share your feedback, as that's very helpful for us as we are planning future programming. Speaking of future programming, immediate future, registration for the April 13th program will open later this week at scvfoundation.org, scvfoundation.org. That's where you'll find those links I just mentioned, as well as recordings of our previous conversations of the Valley. April 13th, we are going to have Jennifer Hughes, the Director of Design and Creative Placemaking for National Endowment for the Arts.
Yep.
And Laura Zabel, the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts, talking about the role that the arts play in economic growth, transforming neighborhoods, and helping connect people to place. So again, that's April 13th, and registration for that program will open later this week. Thank you, Jane, Jennifer, Neil, and Scott. I know it's a challenge to smush all of your professional knowledge into 10 minutes, and you guys did it. Thank you. Thank you again to our partner and sponsor, First State Bank and Trust, and a special thanks to the team here at the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and especially to our incredible Director of Community Impact, Angie Pilgrim, who, among many other things, is really the brains and the energy behind this series and behind all of our convening work. We've got a great team here at the St. Croix Valley Foundation. Would love to chat with you about your concerns, your ideas, your legacy plans for this region. Give us a call. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being part of these important conversations. And I look forward to seeing you again on Zoom in April. Have a great day. Take care. Happy spring.
Thank you, speakers. Good to see